Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panel on financing or selling your studio. My name is Michel Gélinas. I'm a partner with a law firm called Davies in Montreal. I'll be moderating today's panel. Before we jump into it, there's a couple of announcements I think we need to make. The first one, and I'm a lawyer, so I kind of need to say that stuff. We are being recorded, so you need to be aware of that. And the session will be available on replay afterwards. So if you miss anything, you'll be able to look at our presentation later. The other thing is that we have a pretty full agenda, but we may have time for questions. So if you do have questions, you can submit them through the chat mode, and we'll get to it. And if we're unable to, I think you guys, the audience, has our contact info, so you can feel free to reach out to any of us after the fact. So the first thing I'd like to do is just explain why we're doing the panel. As I mentioned before, I'm a lawyer, I'm a corporate lawyer. So what I do mostly is deals, M&A, financing, VC, that kind of stuff. And I do it both in Montreal and Canada and abroad. And I've worked with some of the smaller startup studios, but as well with like the larger AAA type of big studios in the US and internationally. And I think what I've noticed is that a lot of independent studios have really good products, really cool stuff, cool games. But when it comes time to find financing or maybe a strategic partner, they need help. They need a bit of assistance, and sometimes they don't fully realize what they're getting into, and often things can move pretty quickly at the same time. So I think the purpose of the panel is to flag some of these issues, what should be top of mind for independent studios. And obviously, it's a very complicated area. There's a lot of tax, accounting, and even legal issues, can you imagine, that you need to deal with. And it's very complex. And obviously, we can't really go into the nitty-gritty of any of it. So it's really high level. It's really things that should be top of mind when you're looking at getting financing for the studio, or you're looking for strategic partner, just outright selling your studio. So we're fortunate today because we have a very diverse panel. We have someone from the US, we have entrepreneurs, we have a studio owner, we have an M&A specialist, we have a private investor, kind of VC family office. So they'll be able to bring a lot of different perspectives. And I think what you'll see is that people look at it differently based on where they stand. And I think as a studio owner or founder, what's important to remember is to ask a lot of questions as you go through the process, because no one has the absolute truth, and you're in an industry where there's a lot of information that's not publicly available. So that's why it's important to sort of canvas people, ask them what they've done, how they did it, and they'll give you some idea as to what is best for your own situation. So I think what we're going to do now is just basically introduce our various panelists. I'll ask them to describe what they do, who they are, obviously. So we'll start with Alex. So why don't you tell us what you do for a living?
Hi. Sometimes I wonder what I do for a living, but I've been working for 25 years in the technology space. Essentially, I'm a partner in the mergers and acquisitions group at Deloitte, and I've worked on both sides, running a corporate development office, either for Deloitte or actually at Bell Canada for 3.5 years. But other than my stint at Bell, I've been almost 22 years at Deloitte.
Yeah, so I'm the head of strategy and operation for Happy Robotics, which is a company doing haptics for what we call serious gaming. So we also work with studios, but they're not like the games your 14-year-old will play. They're games for surgeons and doctors. So we ultimately work with studios, and we built both the tools for this, so on the user interface, but also the hardware. Also wear another hat for today's discussion, which is my previous life as the investment manager, where I got to acquire movie studios in LA And I got to really see how that ecosystem works, from the content production to the operation to the distribution.
Thank you. Chris, can you tell us about your own experience?
Christopher Chancey. I'm the CEO of MEGAMIGS Entertainment, so a studio that I started 7 years ago. I also founded an accelerator called the Indie Asylum, where we do investments and give access to our network to up-and-comers in the video game space. I teach in 2 different universities, programming, game design, and a bunch of stuff like that. And I am vice president of the board of directors of La Guilde du Jeu Vidéo du Québec, which is the cluster here in Quebec. And in my free time, I enjoy sleeping.
We share something in common. I do like sleeping in my free time. So, which sometimes is, I don't have as much as I would like. Next, we have Nick from Wizards. Very fortunate to have Nick from, I think you're in Seattle. So can you tell us a bit about what you're doing?
That's right. Thanks, Michel. So I'm Nick Mitchell. I'm the Vice President of Legal for Wizards of the Coast, the company that makes Magic the Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons. And in my day-to-day role, I oversee the global legal operations for the division, which is a subsidiary of Hasbro. I also oversee the legal work for our subsidiaries, 2 games, Archetype Entertainment, and they're both game developers, one in the Montreal area, one in the Austin area. And in my previous life, I actually was in private practice representing indie game studios, working with publishers. And so it's kind of see both sides of the deal and the equation. And
Philippe, oh, sorry. Philippe, can you, I'm sure you lack sleep too, so why don't you go ahead and tell us what you do for a living?
No, I can hear him.
I can hear him, yeah. Well, thank you. So in terms of our panel, it's really a Q&A format, and there's basically 3 main topics that we want to talk about. The first one is what do investors look into, like when you're looking for the potential investment? What are you looking for? What's important in terms of the studio, the technology, the people, and so on and so forth? And conversely, what are the studios looking for in an investor or a strategic partner? The second topic has to do with how do you prepare for a deal and maximize value, really executing on your deal. And the third one is to do with something that's often overlooked. People are very keen on getting money or finding a strategic partner, but then this is what I call the day after, like you've done a deal. What happens next? And often integration after a transaction is very critical, and people need to put some thinking into that ahead of the closing to make sure that you have a successful deal with an investor. So I think the first question we have is really a question for Chris, and the question is, you know, you've been in the industry for quite a while. You sit on the board, as you mentioned before. So, what's your perspective on like when indie studios are looking for financing? What's their biggest challenge?
I think to really answer that question the right way, I think we need to give a bit of context. So obviously, the fiscal advantages we have here in Quebec are why most of the bigger studios came here in the first place. So in '96, when Bernard Landry came up with the CTMM, 37% of all salaries paid would go back to the studios at the end of the year. That really kind of was a huge incentive for bigger studios to come into the territory. So these big studios came in, started hiring, and so an ecosystem started developing around those hirees, and obviously the ecosystem started growing and growing and growing. And around the 2010s, the barrier to entry to be able to sell games drastically went down. Basically, with access to free tooling and being able to distribute our projects on our own through platforms like Steam, suddenly it was possible for the developer to be able to reach the consumer directly through digital distribution. And so a lot of the people that were trained at Ubisoft and at the bigger studios like EA and Eidos and all the other studios, they decided to spin off their own companies. And so this is where, honestly, the kind of the growth that we've seen in the past few years is emanating from. And one thing that's really important to consider is that the multimedia tax credit doesn't finance business administration or marketing. What it finances is everything that's close to production of video games. And so all of these new studios were really, really amazing at making games, but they were not as good at selling them. And this is where the underlying issue, I believe, is for this type of conversation. So today, I mean, we have 300 studios in Quebec. We have 15,000 employees. We have had huge growth. And, you know, the next business models that are coming in our industry are looking towards, you know, more intellectual properties, because people are going to want exclusivities, just like Netflix, because this is the new model that's coming up with the Google Stadias and the Xbox Game Passes and the other platforms of the genre. So we expect there'll be more buying of IPs and buying of studios and more mergers and acquisitions. And so I think like this panel comes at a critical moment where we can actually have that discussion. So if I have to answer what the biggest challenges for independent studios are today, for the smaller studios, it's access to funding, like the initial funding. Video games are still looked at as a risky investment. And so that first injection of cash is always a difficult thing to go get. And the second thing that I think is important is the business intelligence to be able to prepare once you've had a bit more maturity to be able to set yourself up for acquisition. And those two things are an issue because we're, like I mentioned, we're an industry that was not trained to do business. We were not trained to do marketing. We were not trained to sell. We were trained to make games, and we're amongst the best in the world to do that. And through La Guilde and through different initiatives, we're sort of starting to construct that business intelligence, and through events like MEGAMIGS, which we've created. And so those are the issues, is that we're currently an industry of artisans, and we need to get better at the business side of things. I think that's kind of putting it simply.
Thank you, Chris. So, George, you're also in kind of emerging company startup. Do you have anything else to add? I mean, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so a little similar to Chris, what Chris mentioned and described about the challenge of the Montreal ecosystem is distribution is the key, right? Access to markets, the money to access those markets, and the reach. And so a company like Happy Robotics, where we have to work with other partners in the studio world with game development and serious gaming, the challenge is to get the game to be pushed in the hands of people. So as an easy example we can mention is we were talking with a group out of Europe that really wanted to integrate one of our hardware that we have, which integrates with their game, very popular game in VR. And they just didn't have the capacity because of the publishers that they had was not necessarily focused on this. And they went through a large transaction over the summer, and now it's a completely new company, and now they have access to much more resources to do the integration. And what Chris mentioned is that talent is very present in terms of the technology, but the big challenge in Montreal is talent in terms of administration and marketing and doing that push. So a company like Happy that needs financing will not only look at the dollar sign and the basic terms, but also look at finding a partner that can help us reach markets and understand the cost of pushing a product globally, which Canada is a little behind the US in terms of understanding the cost of marketing. And so we would look at a partner that had that understanding and the patience to get there.
Thanks, George. Well, now let's sort of switch aside and look at the investor's perspective. So, Philippe, if you put on your like private equity or VC family office hat, exactly, what's your take on it? How do you look at it?
Well, I feel like it really depends on the stage of development of the studio. But I think you must always consider the tie, team, idea, execution. In our case, the decision to invest was made at the idea stage. So it was all about the founders, Patrice Desilets, the mind behind Assassin's Creed, and Jean-François Boivin. It's because it's their vision and they're the ones in charge of putting together the great team. So let's go back to like the tie. So now we have the team, or at least the guys who we believe in to set up this great team. The idea, the studio, the type of games you want to do, and the execution in terms of like these guys have managed teams of hundreds of employees all over the world at their former employer. So for that, we were satisfied. But as you can see, like these are very particular circumstances where we had these guys with an amazing track record looking to start something new. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is basically we made a bet on the individuals in whom we believe in.
Because these guys had credential, they had credibility in the track record already.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's it. Their track record allowed them to raise this a significant sum from the get-go, as opposed to having to do it kind of a step-by-step as the game is developed, which is what I'm understanding is the norm here. So, but going back to the question, I mean, later on, like today, I think the team cohesion becomes more crucial in what they've achieved also so far. So in other words, it's less of a two-man show like it was at the beginning. And finally, I think that there has to be a very good cultural fit because we know we can't operate a studio ourselves, so we want to keep them happy.
Exactly. So let's turn to Nick. Now, obviously, you work for a much larger group, so I'm assuming that you don't really invest in an idea, but you're looking for something a bit more established or might be more consistent with kind of your overall strategy where you have a number of properties and you're trying to achieve some synergies. So what's your perspective on that?
Sure. I think when you're, from a publisher perspective, we're always looking to the indie or the mini developer who has, I don't know if I want to call it like an X factor, but something where you're looking at whether they have the game put in place or whether they have the IP or the management team or a combination of of all of that together. You'd look at an indie developer and say, well, this game, this developer may be in the process of developing key IP as a new title, and the publisher comes in and looks at it and says, we think that there's synergy between what we're doing and what the IP you're developing. So we want to have conversations about whether we would publish and step in, or there'd be an acquisition of the studio itself. The same can be said for developers who are already self-publishing games, and you would look and say, well, there's a track record of success here, and specifically in specific genres. Maybe we're looking to build out a portfolio where we're looking for first-person shooters, or we're looking for RTSs, and you'd say, well, this company here has done, 3 or 4 of them. They have a track record of success. We know that there's talent there, and we're looking to strategically fill holes in our portfolio. Now, we could take that internally, or we could look to the external model. And I think what you find nowadays, both in Quebec as well as in the United States and globally, there are more and more acquisitions going on, and I think part of that is driven by filling portfolio holes. Right? You can build out that skill set, but if you're able to find a core team that is successful, especially in that earlier phase of a studio's life cycle, you can bring them in-house. Have them develop a specific property or a number of properties under that specific IP and complement what you're already doing. And how you make that evaluation, again, I think there's a number of things that go into that. It's the track record of success. It's the founders or the management structure. It's the history of launching specific types of games in different types of platforms. All of that goes in to determine whether or not a larger publisher would be interested in taking a step toward acquiring the smaller indie.
Thanks, Nick. So let's switch gear now and go to how do you prepare for a transaction and try to maximize value in terms of getting a better price or better valuation for your game, or just get some like maybe more competitive financing terms. So this is a question really up Alex alley. So you're obviously, as you describe, an M&A expert. You've worked with a lot of tech companies in the past. So what can you do at a time as a studio to better prepare for a sales process?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So quite a few of the presenters have already talked a little bit about how to build a business plan, essentially. So people, what they want to see investors, whether they're strategic investors or financial investors, they want you to show that, one, you have a plan, two, it's okay to get off plan, but you have to show that you're achieving your plan and you're achieving your milestones. And one of the things that's often looked at and often neglected, especially in this space, in your industry, is really whether you're dependent on anyone. So whether it's dependent on certain IP, dependent on a certain individual, dependent on a customer, dependent on anything else, essentially like government funding, is really people don't like dependencies. So as you build out your plan and try to prepare and attract investors, you need to build that plan that decreases your dependence on individuals. And it's not easy when you're smaller, but the idea is you at least need a plan to show that you will decrease that dependency on someone, so or on funding or any one thing else. And like a couple of people, like Philippe especially, said is essentially when you're building out your team is like joining and partnering with someone is usually something to look forward to and try to achieve. And more investors are looking at social impacts of what we're doing out there in the marketplace and how your company is impacting the social view or social picture of the economy, essentially.
Thanks. Going back to George, has kind of done a bit of both, being an investor and now with emerging company. You went from a role where you're the investor within that company. Did you do anything to help it better prepare to welcome an investor?
So that's a topic for a full hour, if you ask me. So I joined Happily October 2019. So it's been over a year, and it's been quite an adventure. I've been lucky to work with amazingly smart and humble people. But even there was a lot of like cultural shift in understanding what is the role of outside partnership. How do you invite someone into your home while keeping enough control, the rule of the house, but while at the same time giving the comfort to your guests, your investors. And that's been quite a lot of work getting that ingrained in the mentality. But it's important for people to understand that everyone has different objectives, and these objectives can meet. And it's important to present where they meet and to make sure that like you agree on these aspects. So it's been very useful to have both sides, because whenever we speak to VCs, strategic partners, or like way more have more money than we do, is to really frame it in the way that helps them make sense. Well, if you're a smaller group, usually you think about what you have to do for yourself, and you tend to forget the people you work for or work with, which is your investors, your commercial partners, your suppliers, and your customers. So that's really the shift that we push was really on that mentality of being presentable. Let's call it that way.
So I guess what you're saying is agreeing on the vision and your priorities as a firm, so you can clearly articulate that to outside investors, in other words.
Yes, exactly. And the challenge, I think, it comes the same thing probably for creative, because in the world we are engineers, but we are very creative engineers. And it's to understand that people don't care about the smaller details, but they care how all of this will work together. And they focus on execution, just like Philippe said. So you need to prove that you can execute without necessarily showing every single thing. So keeping the big picture discourse or narrative,
There you go. So speaking of investments, our next question has to do with valuation. And I'll ask a question to Philippe, and then I'd like Alex to jump in on that. So basically, when you look at a game, especially early stage, I mean, what is it worth? Often maybe the game has not even launched, for example. And or you might be at a stage where you think there's potential, but you're not quite there yet, or there might be a new and improved version. So what I'm getting at is that the investor might look at it, and the studio might also look at the state of their game, and they may have a very different perspective on what value that there is. So I think what I've seen is ways to bridge that valuation gap. And it might be earnouts, and there's a lot of tax issues and pitfalls associated with that, which we won't be discussing on the panel. I think it's too technical, but when we look at milestones, earnouts, retention payments, I mean, is that the way you bridge the gap typically, or are there other tools? I'd like to hear your perspective. Do you prefer milestone over earnouts, or the other way around? Just give us a bit of clarity on how do you bridge the gap.
All right. Well, I think, like most questions, there's not only one good answer, but to assess a valuation to a studio, or in fact, many companies, or even mostly startup, it's it's more of an art than a science. So it's quite easy to justify a very wide range of valuations. So I think that's something to keep in mind, like not to be offended if you see like, a studio was sold for that much, or I believe I'm worth that much. But everything can be justified with the data available to us. In our case, without going into too much details, we use mostly milestones. But if we had invested in only one game, like an editor would do instead of like a studio, it would be totally different. So that's something to keep in mind. And also the investment horizon plays a role in the selection of the tool to use. You want to make sure to align interests of both sides in the long run. If one is only there for the short term, then you'll use different tools to make sure the interests are aligned. But one thing that was really important from the beginning, because the co-founders, executives, are also important shareholders, was to make sure they understood the split between their role and expectations as management versus as a shareholder. So that's another thing that you have to have a discussion about before deciding on the kind of incentive programs like this.
So let's turn to Alex. Now you do a lot of tech deals, and I think this valuation gap problem is not just in the game industry, but also for tech companies generally. So can you give us your thoughts on how you bridge the gap, and do you think there's one mechanism that's better over other mechanism, or is it really deal specific?
Yeah, it definitely would be deal specific, and these days are presenting even more challenges. So Philippe has answered very well the question. So maybe we could hire you at Deloitte to help us with helping entrepreneurs, actually. But essentially, what we are seeing, especially in the COVID days, the reason why you want to use earnouts is usually for two reasons. One, you want to decrease risk. You want one of the parties to decrease risk, and then the other party wants to maximize value. So the idea, to Philippe's point, is how do you bridge the gap between the two? Well, you bridge the gap between the two by being realistic. I would say that I've done a study. I've been involved in about 150 earnouts, and usually about 75% of the earnouts get paid. And that, to me, is a winning formula. It's not the buyer trying to decrease price, because if you start doing that as a buyer to decrease price, then the people won't last. They won't stay with you. And to Philippe's point, where you separate both the management team and the owners is critical. So you need to agree on a plan upfront. You document the governance process in order to achieve and maximize value, to decrease that risk, and you agree and you get together every month about, are we achieving our common objectives to decrease risk, one, and two, to maximize value. It's no use trying to come up with lots of legal terms to try to minimize the risk for only one party. Is you have to do it together and you have to have fun. And to me, before I help clients agree on an earnout, is I really ask the last question: is, do you think you're going to have fun with this integration process and with this governance process in order to increase value? So that to me is what I'm seeing. And in the COVID days, God knows there are increased risk, and it's happening, and it's happening especially in the tech field more so than ever.
Well, thank you. So I have now another question on valuation, and this one is for Nick. It's really, I would say, the $1 million question, or perhaps one that lawyers like to ask more than M&A and accounting specialists. It's really, you're looking at a game, Nick, and you found this great game. It's about to launch. So you're doing due diligence on the company, obviously. And then you find out that one of the key team members that might have been involved in the concept or doing the lion's share of the coding has left the company already. He's gone to Australia hiking. He's on a sabbatical, never wants to go back to the gaming industry for now. And then you start looking at his contract and his IP assignment, and it's a bit shaky. It's not the standard that you have, or concerned that maybe all of the IP has not been properly assigned to the company. But you really, really, really like that game. It's a great game. So is that a deal killer? I mean, what do you do? Like, how do you fix that problem?
Yeah, it's a good question. It does come up. I think the first way, I would advise to any kind of startup developers or indie developers, always have rights cleared. And, one of the things that I've said in working with clients in the past, in my previous life, is if you're a developer and your exit strategy is acquisition, one of the core jobs that you have is to ensure that your company is tied up, with a nice little bow, that it's easy for somebody to come by, do the due diligence work, look through your records, understand where the chain of title comes from, the management structure, the ownership structure, so that an investor or a publisher can look at that and say, okay, these people have their documentation in order, they know what they're doing, and it's worthwhile for us to jump in and make this investment in partnership with them. When you go through the diligence process and you find that there's issues with chain of title, that can kill a deal. It depends on how extreme. In the idea that you'd have a partner, let's say, or a co-founder of a developer who, for whatever reason, their contractual relationship with the actual developer doesn't assign over IP rights, but this person was instrumental in developing the underlying IP that's the basis of the game, or the programming code. If that's not lined up, then that can kill a deal. It can also have a significant impact as to the valuation of a company. And you'll see sometimes developers, people wonder, why doesn't anybody ever buy these people? Or look at this great game that they've released. Why isn't anybody looking at them? And sometimes that can be the underlying issue. And that doesn't go necessarily just with a co-founder or a primary person in the management structure. This could be somebody who's a key programmer who develops some piece of code. If the value of a developer isn't necessarily a game itself, but potentially a tool suite that they've developed, or some type of a hybrid engine that they've put together. If they don't have the actual work for hire and assignment provisions put in place, then what you're buying there is fraught with issues. And so that can affect the valuation. Does that mean that a company wouldn't make it worthwhile and say, you know what, it's so great of an opportunity that we can't pass it up? People do that, obviously. But I do think, it behooves any type of an indie developer to have that worked out ahead of time. Now, in the situation where that's not the case, where you say, well, we wish we would have done it, we didn't do it, we were 5 or 6 people that started in our basement, and then we kind of grew and just kind of fell by the wayside because we're not business people, we're game designers and developers. You can cure that. You can go to the individuals who may no longer be involved and say, hey, we've got this great opportunity. We're going to sell the company. We need you to sign this. And you're going to receive some form of compensation to ensure that, the actual agreement is binding. That can happen too. It's not a good position for a developer to be in. I mean, I will say that, because now you're put in a position where you don't have a lot of leverage to negotiate to cure those rights. So it's best to do it on the front end. And I would, anybody who's attending the conference and watching this, always get that taken care of ahead of time. It's the same thing as, having an operating agreement between partners, having your corporation documents put together correctly. All of those things are key and are not necessarily thought of through the due diligence process, but people like myself, people who are going to be looking at the financial side, they're going to hone in on that very early on. And if it's not there, then yeah, it can cause significant impacts.
Thank you. That's a pretty fulsome answer.
Can I just jump in and ask a question? Because I think that was super interesting what was just said. I'm wondering, in the kinds of deals that publishers, third-party publishers, like many are here right now, MEGAMIGS, making deals with a lot of developers. More and more, I think, the intellectual property is remaining in the hands now of the developers, whereas maybe 10 years ago, it was not the case. A lot of the publishing companies used to take the IP. How much does term come into play, for exclusivities on sequels for an IP? How much do ancillary rights on merchandise or movies or potential TV shows come into it? How does that affect the evaluation of a company? And if the term is too long, is that sometimes a deal breaker? Or when you want to make an acquisition, do you sometimes even just buy out basically the share of a publisher? Has that ever happened before? I don't know if anyone can speak to that.
Well, I can speak to some of that. It's actually really good questions because you do see that now. You see, developers who, let's say they're doing a publishing deal. Maybe it's not a full acquisition, but they're stepping in saying, we've got this great game, we want to come to you to publish. Historically, you would look at, the console manufacturers, the big publishers stepping in and saying, well, we may not buy the developer, but we're buying the IP and we own it outright, and you're going to do a couple games for us. We'll see how it goes. Depending on how strong the IP is, I think developers can say, I want to retain IP ownership. And then everything becomes negotiable, to your point. And you come in and say, well, all right, if we're acquiring the IP, or we're not acquiring the IP, but we're going to get exclusive rights to publish on multiple platforms as us being the publisher, what does that look like from a sequel perspective? You're probably going to have some level of fixed terms as to an escalation. So the first one is going to be X amount of money, whether it's a royalty or whatever the advances are going to be. Then the sequels will in some way scale up depending on how popular they are, whether you're basing that on Metacritic scores, whether you're basing that on just financial results, et cetera. And then that can factor into what kind of a publisher you have. Some publishers will say, yes, if we're going to be publishing this, then we want to retain the rights for ancillary products, merchandise, entertainment. And then it just falls into the back end. What is that worth to a developer to say, well, us as a publisher published the first 2 games. We've got to deal with Netflix to do a series. We think it's great. So, what is that worth to me as a developer who made the IP? Is there some type of a fee? And then it gets into kind of the nuance of each individual type of product because, do you get a producer credit? Are you actually getting just a royalty based on revenue from, the purchase of the series to Netflix or Amazon? Is it? And then you get the merchandising rights, and that can be all worked out as well. It's an interesting model and one that puts more power back into the developer as opposed to the publisher. And I think really what drives that is twofold. I think, again, it's the strength of the IP, which is hard, by the way, out of the gate, because as a large publisher, you're going to come in and say, we love the IP, but you haven't launched any games yet. So we don't really know if it resonates. We think it's really cool. We want to be a part of it, but we're going to need that exclusivity if we're going to be investing a ton of money, at least for a period of time. I think, and then the other side of that is, for developers, if they're in a position where they've been successful and they've launched a game and the IP does resonate with a subsection of a community or it's just popular in the genre, much like the music industry or some of the film industry and television industry, there's a lot more ability for developers to self-publish and to be successful without the big publishers coming in and stepping in and saying, we can do it all for you. And so that creates a different equation. Would you want to be in a scenario where you're working with a publisher to get a larger deal or potentially access to additional resources for ancillary merchandise? And I think it's all negotiable, but it really is going to come down to the track record of success to the developer, and then the IP and how well it resonates within the industry.
Thanks. It's a very fulsome answer. We did get a question. Maybe this one is worth asking, and I think I'm not sure if we're able to answer it because there's a lot of information that's not publicly available. But the question is, what multiples are you seeing in the industry over the last 12 months for indie studios? And I think because of COVID and everything, it's probably all over the map. That's kind of my sense. But I don't know if Nick or someone else has any views on that in terms of what you might have seen.
I would say that's a good answer. It's all over the map.
Yeah, I would agree. So, and especially with earnouts, what's happening now, and there's some crazy multiples out there because there's a lot of money out there, but there's lots of appetite to want to do deals, and you'd be surprised as to how much people are wanting to pay. Having said that, some people are not silly either. They're not going to pay too much, but the less dependency you have on either an employee base, a team base, an IP, the more the multiples will be, and the more the payments will be as well. So that's what I'm seeing out there. And if anyone, I have a list of transactions the last 2 years. I'm happy to spend some time with anyone that's asked the question to walk them through the transactions.
Another question that we received, I think it seems to be generating a lot of questions. We can't answer all of the questions we're getting. So we're sort of picking and choosing, unfortunately. Sorry for that. But another one, which I thought was kind of interesting, is having the government as one of the main shareholders a positive or a negative point for future acquisitions or investments? It's a good thing.
Most of the time it's a good thing if you have a plan. So there are reasons sometimes why it's good to have them, right? So it depends if you like to see a glass half full or half empty, right? You always find a reason for making a decision at one time and you move forward with it, right? And sometimes it may be time to get rid of a certain group of investors to take away any negative feelings from having someone like or a party like a government. So.
Yeah, my own experience has been that if you look especially at foreign buyers, they typically don't like to have the government in the ownership structure. The only example I've seen where it's looked at positively is more like regulated industry or something under governmental scrutiny, where it's almost useful to have an ally that's within the government. But often, I think foreign studios would be concerned about having the government infrastructure. I don't know, Nick, if you have any views on that, but it's probably what you're going to tell me.
Yeah, it's something in the States, you don't see it very often, to be honest. I mean, it's just because of the way we have our investment structures. Usually there's some level of a tax incentive or potentially, you could have a contract with a government entity where you're doing work. But I think if you were in a scenario, like if we had a potential acquisition target and they had an ownership interest or a governmental ownership interest, I'd have to think about that as to what the impacts are, why that occurred, and what impacts that would have in an overall acquisition.
I think it kind of goes back to the shareholder agreement. If they have a right to select whoever they want to sell it to, or if they're more like a passive investor in the backseat, it will change the answer here.
Yeah, I think if you have like a government like investor like BDC, which is like a crown agency, that's a different type of investor because they really are a financial investor, and their objective is to help the company grow and have a successful exit. So, and to your point, I think this is exactly, you need to look at the veto rates and what kind of governance rate they would have and how that may help or impede your plans for the business going forward. I think as we move forward, another question we had for Nick is that, are you concerned about open source being used in the software or not? I know the other sort of segment of the industry, not gaming, there's some companies, if there's open source, it's a big problem for them. And I'm just wondering, what's your reaction to this?
Yeah, and I take this. This is as a lawyer, I gotta have the disclaimer as well. This is my personal opinion, not that of Hasbro or Wizards. But I'd say that I think open source can be problematic depending on what open source is used in the development of a game. And I think that's just the fact of open source. That doesn't mean that necessarily developers shouldn't use open source. In fact, I think most developers nowadays, with most publishers, use some form of open source, whether they're pulling certain types of libraries or et cetera from GitHub or somewhere else. The issue that comes from open source is what is the underlying license to that technology. And there are some open source licenses which are fine. And there are others that are problematic. And then there are more that are outside of the standard where individual developers can create their own license. And so one thing I would say to anybody who's developing a game and using open source, they need to track that and have an audible trail as to what they put into their source code. And a lot of people don't think about that. Now, the good news is that over the last many years, there have been a number of tool sets that have been released that can allow companies to audit source code from a developer. So just as a publisher, somebody may say, hey, we've got a game, here's our game. We go through an audit to make sure that there's nothing in there that could be problematic. I think when you're talking in the M&A environment, having that up front is incredibly helpful, because if I'm a developer or I'm a publisher, you come to me and I say, we've got this great game, we're close to what could be considered to be maybe a beta release or something like that. We start looking at it and I'll say, okay, well, that's great. Is there anything in the code that's going to be problematic? Do we have any open source that would preclude a commercial launch of this game? Do we have any redistribution issues of source code? And if a developer can't tell me yes or no, and that's going to give me pause, and that can have impacts not only on the M&A, but the release of the product, because we need to know to ensure that we're complying with our obligations to those individuals who created the open source. So it's a kind of a long roundabout way of saying that open source is not necessarily bad, but you need to be careful with it, and you need to make sure that you're keeping your house in order in its use so that you can audit what you put in. The other thing about open source, which a lot of people forget about, is even if the open source is fine and the license that it's released under allows for commercial use and doesn't allow for a redistribution of the product or a derivative product for free, a lot of them have attribution requirements. And so if you're not tracking that, then you're in violation of the license. And so you'll want to make sure that if you're using open source, that you've got some README file, or there's something built into the code, or there's something built into the credits that is actually giving attribution correctly to the developers who created the source code that you're using. So it just gives another reason why you need to track this stuff. You need to be careful about it, so that you don't find yourself in a position that you can't answer that simple question, which is what's in your source code.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Nick. Now I'd like to go to maybe a bit of a different topic. It's not something that we see often in the video game industry, but I have seen it, and I think it typically involves more significant studios or investments. But what I'm getting at is an option. I mean, typically, when you're looking for financing or selling your studio, you might be in exclusive discussion with a partner. But there's other ways of doing it, and one way is what we call the competitive option for financing, or just an outright sale of the company. So, Alex, could you sort of describe what's an auction and how it can be potentially used in the situation where you're looking to monetize the company?
Yeah, and Michel, sometimes people ask about the use of external advisors as well, and how that could be useful. So an external advisor as good as you, Michel, right? That could be a very big advantage, right? So an auction is, if you want to compare it to auctioning or putting your house for sale, pretty much very similar, except there are obviously intricacies and there are some differences, but you can think about it as first you come up with the plan that we talked about, where over 1 or 2 year period, you prepare your business for sale or for investment, and then you start soliciting some people. So you, as you said, Michel, you could have very closed-ended processes or auctions where you're only going to go to a couple publishers or a couple of interested parties or private equity, or you can make it wide. So the disadvantage of an auction is you will be sharing some confidential information, and you may scare some employees away. but I can tell you that most auctions, when well run, there are much better or bigger advantages, and especially when you have an external advisor who knows the space, you will generate some benefit from it. You will generate maximized value, and you will especially save on anxiety. So advisors know how to deal with what's called deal fever. So first month can be fun as someone selling a business, but I can guarantee you that after a couple of weeks there, you start to have less fun, and that's what the role of the advisor is to help you manage that anxiety and to help you manage the other parties without any emotions. So, and they act as an advisor to you. So the auction process really is to help you put that process or product or business out there for sale, help you manage the process in a very organized manner, approach the parties, and essentially maximize price and limit risks for you as a seller.
Thanks. And you touched upon something else I think that's very interesting. Often you speak to entrepreneurs and they say, I know my business, I can negotiate, I know what it's worth. And they don't see any value in advisors. So like often, I think I've heard you before, just the fact that we're involved, Deloitte will increase the valuation because they know they're dealing with somebody credible. They won't, you can't really try to pull a fast one on a firm such as Deloitte, for example. So what would you tell to an entrepreneur who's questioning the value of having sophisticated advisors?
Yeah, you're asking me, Michel, right? So so essentially, to me, the biggest advantage is in managing the emotions and managing the other party, and it allows you as an investor or as a business to help continue manage your business. So you won't have time to focus 40, 50 hours a week and just managing the process. Someone else will do that for you and give you an unemotional view. You need to make sure that you hire someone who knows the space, and you need to also speak to a couple of people have talked about this today in this session, is speak to others who've gone through it and told you the advantages of having an advisor in the process, like selling a business or looking for financing. So I think it's that simple, is people know the advisors know what they're doing, and they will be there to help you maximize value. And the fee component, if people are afraid of that, is more than justified through the value they bring. And especially when you have a competitive process, the idea is the fee will be a minimal versus the advantage that they will bring, especially on value or dollar value.
Thank you. So if I can ask you, like, what's your
Philippe?
perspective on it? Philippe?
Oh, yeah. About the advisors, something I want to add is also how they play a big role in a sense that as a company owner, this process will usually be the first time you're doing this or the second time you're doing this. But the people bidding on your company, usually they've been doing that their whole life. They have all the information on the market. So there is this data asymmetry that you need to manage. And with the help of the advisors, it's easier to be kind of on the same level as the people you're negotiating with.
It helps, I guess, finding creative solutions to unusual problems. So, George, you have, again, a pretty similar background, having been an investment firm and now with an emerging company. So when you look at advisors, what's your take on it? Do you think it's useful to have a team around you, or do you think this is something you can manage on your own?
So I completely agree with both Alex and Philippe. You need to understand what you're good at. And if you're the CEO, any executive of a company that's creating content or whatever the operation is, your talent is selling the dream, aligning your team, and making sure that you execute on it. You're not an expert in transactions. You have seen very few transactions in your life, and no one will be able to know the industry better than people that do that day in, day out. That's a reality. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that it's extremely taxing to do a transaction, especially if you're on the operator side. So like Alex said, like, you'll be excited at first, you'll be cheering and going for dinners and you'll find this exciting, but it gets very repetitive very quickly. And you still have your whole team at home waiting for you to tell them where to go, and you'll be tired and your operation will suffer. The thing that people need to keep in mind is transactions don't always go through. So if you spend all that time like talking with investors and people and nothing goes through, and you spend none of that time running your business business will suffer and your team's morale will suffer. And then like your next transaction you'll try to do will be harder because you'll be in a worse position than you were at first. So advisors are extremely important. They'll give you business intelligence that you don't have access to. They'll give you the sound advice that you need. And the reality, we always think that what we built is more valuable than it is. And that's just, it's called the endowment effect. I actually co-wrote a paper on this in my young years. But the idea is that like, if you build something, you think it's worth so much more than it really is in the real world. And you need that pragmatism when you do a transaction, because otherwise you'll just waste time. So like Alex said, the fees are inconsequential compared to the results you'll get from using the right people to help you go through this on the legal side, accounting side, tax side, and even operations.
Well, thank you. We're almost at the end. We have 3-4 minutes left. So I really wanted to talk about the day after, what happens after the transaction, which is often overlooked, especially if you have like an earnout, for example. It's really important to make sure that people are aligned in terms of what they want to do and how they want to develop the company going forward. So maybe we only have time for Nick, but I wanted to ask you, Nick, what makes a successful transaction? How do you deal with integration? I mean, how do you keep the employees interested? Is it retention payments? Do you do something else? Is there a secret sauce? I think you're on mute.
Of course I'm on mute. No, I think it's a combination of a number of things, and what makes a successful integration in that transition period. And one thing that drives that, I mean, so from a key man, keeping people around, you can look at the types of incentives you put in place for employees, whether it's part of an earnout. There's bonus structures that can be done for the launch of a game or sequels of a game, and you can financially incentivize people to be there to an extent that they're going to be there until they find a better offer, that might put them out of that retention side. I think what's truly important and something that needs to be discussed as part of the M&A process is what is the short, mid, and long-term strategy of the developer being integrated into a publisher. Is the idea that the developer is going to stay separate and run autonomously and just be part of the larger organization? Is it a scenario where this publisher or the developer is going to be, launching the game that it's got, but then, its team is going to be moved on to different projects that the publisher may have? Is it a hybrid? Is the idea of taking one team and then spinning it out and growing that developer because the publisher has a lot of trust and belief in the management and being able to expand that out? I think all those things are extraordinarily important conversations to have as you go through the M&A process, because once you have an understanding of where that's going to go, that can help not only create a successful integration, but can retain people. If people get tired of working on the same thing over and over again. If you're buying, a developer, and the idea that is we're just going to buy this developer and have them launch a game and then make 500 sequels to it, it's going to be very hard over the long term to retain that talent. Whereas if you're saying, well, we're buying a developer, but we really like the talent because we want to do different types of games, but we think it's a good skill set, incentivizing not only the management structure, but the rank and file of the developer that, hey, we're doing this, we're going to be doing that, that can all tie into retention as well. So I think, fundamentally having a good idea and understanding between the parties as to what the long-term, marriage of these two entities is going to look like is fundamental to its success.
Thank you. So we're pretty much at the end of our time, so we won't be able to talk about the other integration issues. Maybe that's another discussion next year. So Chris, I would ask you maybe for some final words before we wrap it up.
Well, it's a personal credo of mine to surround myself with people who know much more about certain things than myself. And I think, this panel has shown that I still have a lot to learn about financing and acquisitions and all of this entire world. So I think, the key takeaways for me, and I think for a lot of independent studios should be, first of all, work on your team and work on your track record first. If you're able to develop a solid team that's able to have that track record, you'll be able to put any potential investor at ease. People don't like dependency has come up, and I think that's a very interesting point. And it also speaks to the point that you should always have advisors around you or a network of people that you can go to have answers to certain questions, particularly when it comes to contracts with publishers or different third parties that might be involved in a project. There was the social impact angle I found interesting as well, because we don't often talk about what strategies investors are looking at in the next few years. And I think that was a glimpse maybe into what new investors are kind of trying to accomplish or trying to go in that direction. Having obviously a pragmatic approach and understanding that the best deals are win-win, and that the best deals are going to come when two entities are able to have objectives that meet, like George mentioned. And Nick really quickly mentioned it, and I think this is really the base. It's really the start for any independent studio to have success in this field, is to have an exit strategy. And just that alone could probably have been an hour-long talk. But understanding why you're in a business, and is it a lifestyle business? Do you want to grow this business? What's the objective in 5 years, in 10 years? If you can't answer those questions, I think it's important as an independent developer to have that tough talk with yourself to understand, realistically where you're going to see yourself in the next few years and where you want to be, and sometimes the lifestyle is all that you want, and that's perfectly fine. And I think, that would have been an interesting question also to see how investors see that. Like, are they looking for eternal growth, or are they looking just for stable teams? But we'll come back to that in another panel one day, I'm sure. Basically, all of these little things and a lot more of the tidbits that were said here, I'm probably going to watch this panel again just to kind of go through a lot of what was said. I think it was mostly appreciated by everyone that was watching, to be able to kind of get a glimpse on the other side of the table and see what investors are looking for.
Well, thank you. I think that's pretty much all the time we have. We're actually 2 minutes over. So I would just like to thank the panelists. And again, there's a lot of questions we're not able to answer. But if you want to send us emails or messages, I'm sure we'll be happy to answer the questions. So again, thanks everyone, and I guess our session is officially over.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.